going to start a climate change documentary. I figured, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way first. Climate change is real. And despite what some people will tell you, every climate scientist in the world agrees that if we don't make some drastic changes soon, the future of our planet is looking pretty dismal. I'm no climate warrior, and I know I came to the climate fight late, but better late than never. I was the guy that used to leave lights on when he would leave the room. The recycling buckets out in front of the house, that's my wife. The compost bucket in the kitchen, that's my wife. The EV car in the driveway, that's her too. But here I am, let's talk about climate change. Back in December, I read an article in the New York Times by a guy named Christopher Magg about how the scallops on Long Island were literally dying before they could be harvested. Since I grew up out there, that sent me down the rabbit hole, and next thing you know, I'm looking at blue crabs and oysters down in Maryland, bleached coral down in Florida, and next thing you know, I'm hip deep in a climate change documentary. My journey making this film has reinforced two things for me. Firstly, that climate change is the single most important issue of our time, particularly in our 2024 election year. Secondly, I understand that climate change and global warming are these gigantic issues and how can one person make a difference, but it's not just one person. It's a lot of one persons making a difference together, and you're going to see this in the film. I'm Charlie Spickler. Welcome to Rising Tides.
When you have work to do that gives you the feeling that it's worth investing every ounce of energy you have into it, the work itself gives you energy back. It's a cousin to the saying that the antidote to climate despair is climate action.
Sure, you know what this is? It's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
The antidote to democracy despair is democracy action.
And you can see how that polar vortex measurably brings the cold air down to New England, where we are right now. And if you don't want, and this is produced by NASA, right? These are pretty serious people. So you can believe NASA, and you can believe what their satellites measure on the planet, or you can believe the senator with the snowball.
People are not affecting climate change. You're going to tell me that back in the Ice Age, how much taxes did people pay, and how many changes did governments make to melt the ice?
I would close by saying this, and I hope that all of you either agree or come to agree with this. Even though the danger is high, the opportunity is high, the stakes are high, it is a privilege, really and truly a blessing, to live in a time when we have the opportunity to really make such a consequential difference that can benefit those who come after us. This is a rare moment in human history. We are alive right now when the future of humanity is being decided in important ways. So, how do you find the energy? Wow, how can we find more energy?
There's a lot more going on out on Shelter Island than just dying scallops, and a lot of it is man-made.
When I was a young man and scalloping was good, I never dreamed. I always thought that at that time in my life, when I got to be the age I am now, that I would be able to do a little scalloping, a little clamming, a little fishing, small carpentry jobs, whatever, and we'd be able to survive very nicely. There's no way that I could ever figure it would be like this.
No.
So back in the 50s or something, there was less scallops for a while. Yeah, my Uncle Matty talked about that when I was cussing out all the grass one day when we were scalloping. He said, don't you ever cuss out the grass, because without the grass, we lost our grass years ago, and that's when we lost our scallops.
Right.
You've got to have the grass for the scallops and all your little small crustaceans and your small your flounder and all that stuff to live in. That's their home. And once we got that brown tide in '85, we lost all our grasses, and that's what happened. We lost our soft clams, oysters, scallops, everything. Everything died. The only thing that survived was our hard shell clams, because I think they were down below the surface so much. But that algae took the sunlight away from everything on the bottom that was growing. And that was our biggest, that was a starter.
According to Dr. Stephen Tomasetti, who studies the Peconic Bay scallops extensively, warming and hypoxia reduced the performance and survival of northern bay scallops. 2019 saw the worst dying off of scallops in decades, at least as bad as 1985, if not worse, and Wayne and his fellow scallopers are still feeling the after effects today. It's not just the scallops being affected by warming waters. The blue crabs and the oysters in the Chesapeake Bay are also being severely affected by a number of issues, climate change being a major contributing factor.
For better or worse, the impacts of climate change in the Chesapeake Bay region are here. So for a lot of folks, they may not understand why what is happening, but they do understand on a daily basis that, for example, here in Annapolis, Maryland, we're seeing coastal flooding on days where there hasn't been any rain in the past week.
These low-lying businesses right here, they have sandbags out front. We're not really sure how they're doing on the inside, and I say that only because there is one business that looks like they're pumping out water right now. Officials, they've tried blocking off this road, but that water just keeps moving in over here. You really can't tell where the sidewalk starts, where the road ends, and where the water is, which makes it very dangerous for people when they're walking out through the Annapolis City Dock area.
They're seeing erosion along their shorelines. They're seeing that jellyfish are appearing earlier and sticking around longer, and feeling that the water temperatures are warming. So we like to point out to folks that these are the symptoms, these are the effects of climate change. And once people understand that what they're observing, even within their own lifetimes, are the result of climate change, it makes it easier to understand that the types of impacts that they're experiencing firsthand are those same types of impacts that the animals and water quality of the Chesapeake Bay are impacted by as well.
So I wanted to learn more about the blue crabs in Maryland. So I went down. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation took me on one of their crab boats with Captain Bart. We had a great day out on the bay. Didn't catch one crab.
And so we are in 13 feet of water. And our first pot comes up empty. It's April, so crabs really move because of two different factors: water temperature and salinity. So as the water temperatures drop in the fall, the crabs kind of migrate to the deeper parts of the bay and farther south, where it's saltier, and they overwinter in the bottom. So they actually burrow down into the bottom and bury themselves there for a couple months, where they just kind of lay dormant. As water temperatures start to rise again in the spring, they come out of that burrow, they come out of the bottom, and they start moving back up the bay. The bay's salinity changes throughout the year. So we're about 140 miles from where the bay meets the ocean. So we're still, this is brackish water, so a mixture of fresh and salt water. The bay will get saltier throughout the spring and into the summer, and be its saltiest end of the summer and the fall. And so that salt wedge pushing up is one of the reasons crabs migrate up the bay. As the water's warm, gets saltier, they move up the bay.
Hi, my name is Mrunal Khadge. I'm originally from India, but I work here in Burlington, Vermont, as a preschool teacher. and I graduated from Bennington College with a degree in environmental studies and dance. And I am very passionate about changing the world and changing the climate crisis that we are in. And I am here because I want to dive deeper and learn more about the climate advocacy and just kind of listen and share ideas about what we can do as individuals to find solutions to better the place that we live in. And we need leaders that first of all believe in climate change and know that climate change is a fact. And second of all, are going to passionately work towards creating effective environmental policies, and not just creating them, but also implementing them.
Big business has been using misinformation and denial for over a century. In the 20s, the automotive industry used misinformation and denial to avoid having to put safety features in their cars. No conscience on these people. Later on, Big Tobacco did the same thing. Lies, misinformation, denial that their product was killing people. Now, for the last 30 years, Big Oil and Big Coal using the same exact playbook, just with a new coat of paint. I think it's lead-based paint.
The strength and breadth of the scientific consensus on these questions is really, really significant. And when the fossil fuel polluters began really in earnest back in the 1980s, they started long before that, but really they amped up dramatically in the middle 80s. They started by trying to deceive the public into thinking that scientists were in disagreement about this. And what they did is they went out and they collected a bunch of pseudoscientists. Actually, at one point, ExxonMobil, on the eve of one of the IPCC reports, this document came out in discovery of one of the lawsuits. ExxonMobil offered $10,000 for each pseudoscientific paper that could be published to undermine the impression that there was a scientific consensus. $10,000 per paper. And they succeeded to a point in creating the false impression that the scientists are still arguing about this. They're not sure. So that just invites the public to say, well, it's going to be hard to solve this if it's real. If they're still arguing about it, let's just wait and see how that comes out before we really undertake some very difficult steps. And they attacked, Sherwood Rowland was attacked. This is the guy, again, who co-discovered the reason for the stratospheric ozone hole. His invitations to conferences were canceled because donors from industry said you can't have him, etc. And in fact, Rosina, when I left the White House involuntarily in January 2001, the incoming administration got a famous letter that's been published now from ExxonMobil with instructions for the incoming administration on the people they have to fire. Bob Watson, who was the head of the IPCC and was he was terrific, and they said, you got to get rid of him. And they singled out 3 scientists that were working in the government, one of whom was Rosina, who they labeled the most dangerous woman in the world, and you can see for yourselves.
In 1985, the town of Riverhead constructed a 3-stage sewage treatment plant at the head of the Oceanic Bay. Unfortunately, at that time, it was only a 2-stage treatment plant, and it started dumping partially treated sewage into the bay. That was the same year as the Brown Tide. Coincidence?
The reasons, the only thing we meaning people that did any work on the bay to earn a living is it's ever since the Brown Tide started in May of '85. And that may not be the only contributing factor. I mean, the waters are a little bit warmer than they were back then, so global warming, that might have something. It's not just one thing, it's a combination of things. Years ago they said, people living near the water, the cesspool might have overflowed. And, the effluent running into, that's a drop in the bucket compared to what happened in May of '85 when they started dumping partially treated sewage out into the Pocahontas.
Clearly, havoc is being played with the habitat of the Oceanic Bay. I spoke to Dr. Peter Oyster, who specializes in habitat, about ocean habitat's vulnerability to man-made interference and climate change. You know, there's a whole world down there full of animals that we're not treating much better than we are the ones up here.
Habitat can be different for different species, even though if they're occupying the same plot of seafloor or water column. Everybody needs slightly different elements in the place that they live in order to survive, grow, reproduce, etc. And habitats are often described as the physical features that can be used to describe a place. And so that includes the characteristics of water, temperature, depth, whether it's muds or sands or cobbles or boulders and sand waves, boulder reefs, those kinds of places. But habitat also includes the species that provide structure in these places. So we don't describe, some nearshore areas are sandy, but they're dominated by seagrass meadows. So it's the biological part, the seagrass, that provides a good deal of the structure for the organisms that live there. Same with kelp forests or coral reefs or rocky reefs that are dominated by sponges or cold water corals. And then even small organisms like hydroids and bryozoans and things that most people haven't heard of that live on sand and cobbly kinds of bottoms. But if you're a tiny fish, these small organisms that have stalks and trunks, etc., provide structure for places to hide in order to capture food that lives on these things, and for places to reproduce. So that's the broad perspective on what a habitat is.
Speaking of habitat, what happens when global warming and climate change completely destroy one?
My project is basically looking at coral bleaching throughout Miami and the upper Florida Keys, and looking at patterns and seeing what could cause these patterns, factors beyond thermal stress. So coral bleaching is when corals can get really stressed and they expel their symbiotic algae. And this symbiotic algae is really important because it gives them a lot of their nutrients. So when they bleach, they can recover. However, they are much more susceptible to things like disease and other stressors. So the issue with this past year, 2023, there was a historic bleaching event, and it was kick-started by a marine heat wave. And this marine heat wave happened in early July, which is very early on in the bleaching season. So these corals got stressed very early and continued to accumulate that heat stress throughout the summer. It was a very hot summer. So the Upper Keys saw a lot of mortality. They saw a lot of bleaching, and unfortunately a lot of reef sites fully died. Miami experienced a lot of the same heat stress, but Miami did not bleach as bad. So that sort of opens up an interesting research question as to why. So we look at coral bleaching caused a lot by thermal stress, and that is very true. But there are things beyond thermal stress that can sort of affect coral bleaching. And my advisor came up with some different hypotheses as to why Miami's reefs didn't bleach as bad, or why the upper Keys reefs did bleach a little bit worse. So I'm looking into those hypotheses to see what could cause those patterns.
I've been concerned about climate for at least 20 years. And now I'm retired. I spend virtually all of my free time thinking about it and acting on it. I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby and also just started the leadership for Northern Colorado's Go Electric Colorado, which helps the community in electrifying their homes and making them more energy efficient. Yeah, that I love, because I go and work with real people in their real homes and help them think through the fairly complex journey that there is to make their homes more energy efficient, and those that are particularly climate conscious, and help them through over the hurdles and hold their hand through the process. Heat pumps, for example, sealing up their homes, putting in more insulation, and there are a lot of people in Colorado who are starting on this journey. The reason why I'm involved. The reason why I think this is important, because I want my grandchildren to have a future. My oldest grandchild is 4 years old. She's going to be 80 in the year 2100. And I want her to be alive, well, and in a healthy, wealthy environment.
The one thing that makes me hopeful is that while making this movie, the sheer number of people I've met who bring in their own ideas and climate solutions back to their own communities. We're seeing unprecedented rise in ocean temperatures all over the planet, which in turn are causing major heat stresses in most of our oceans. Dr. Susanna Hancock is on the forefront of the science of oceanic heat rise and the critical melting of the Arctic.
So in the Great White North, or Great White South, we also have what we call the third pole, which are the alpine regions of the world. So the Himalayas, the European Alps, we've got glaciers in parts of Africa, South America, etc. I am going into these regions. My preferred method of this is going and skiing across these regions. So I'll go out for a couple months at a time with pulling a sledge that can weigh 200 kilos and setting off on skis with some data to collect. And I've been most recently looking at methane coming through the ice cap. So this is something that we know has been happening, but we haven't really been able to calculate it yet. We have very few real-time sensors in the Arctic. So for example, we have maybe one per area of the size of West Virginia across this area that is larger than the US. Go up and collect some of this data and then try to put this into this global picture of what these changes that we're seeing. Again, this is in the Arctic, and specifically my area of interest there is an area that's warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. The Arctic at large is about 4 times faster right now warming than the rest of the planet. And so going into these regions where we're seeing exceptionally fast warming, exceptionally fast melting, Greenland, where I'm supposed to be this spring, is melting at a rate of about 13 million liters per second. So you can think about how much meltwater that's producing in those global changes. And that's where we get changes that are isolated in this region initially, but they have implications globally.
For decades, the fossil fuel industry has spent millions and millions of dollars to discredit the climate scientists who are on the front lines of the climate fight. For activists like Emily Atkin, calling them out on it is her life's work.
I think we're at a point where most people understand that climate change, misinformation, and disinformation is something that is fueled by profit. It's not just something that happens organically because people are misunderstanding what's happening. There's a massive profit motive to spreading misinformation about climate change for industries that emit carbon. Industries that emit carbon are some of our most profitable industries, not only in the US but across the world, such as the fossil fuel industry, such as the plastics industry, the meat and dairy industries, animal agriculture in general. Any industry that creates massive amounts of product, so even tech industry, Amazon, for example, is a massive carbon polluter. And any industry that has interest in carbon has interest in climate misinformation, whether it be through spreading that information or enabling the spread of that information. And that's something I think that isn't talked about quite enough. The problem that we have isn't just with fossil fuel companies funding climate denial. It's with tech companies making profit from spreading that climate denial. Let's say Twitter or Facebook taking advertising money from ExxonMobil or from the American Plastics Association to spread an ad that says Exxon is investing in carbon capture and solving the climate crisis.
Operations.
Like carbon capture.
And clean energy from hydrogen.
So who are we?
Believe it or not, ExxonMobil.
Or plastic is recyclable, right? We're at this point where we sort of expect companies to do that, but we don't think about the enablers. And often the enablers are companies that have made big promises about climate change, like let's say Google or YouTube. These are companies that will make big pronouncements about how sustainable they are and yet take money from fossil fuel industries, from polluting industries in general, to spread that misinformation. It's the same with public relations. I think one of the most interesting areas of misinformation that we should really be educated on and looking at is the public relations industry. Exxon and API don't make their ads themselves. Marketing people make it for them. And those same marketing people are often really, they think they're doing really good things for the world, or they like to purport that they're doing really good things for the world.
It's not often you get to hear what's actually going on in Congress. The truth just might shock you, but probably not.
Yeah, it was new. We were still trying to get people to understand what climate change was, how it was caused by, the burning of fossil fuels, etc., and why they ought to take it seriously. We're in a different place now. I think the scientific community, had, formed consensus a long time ago through the UN and other bodies. That's being taken seriously, I think, by most governments around the world. The problem is here in the United States, we have an entire political party, a conservative political party that rejects it all and is completely beholden to fossil fuel. And we have a conservative news and information ecosystem that is an echo chamber for that climate denial. So it's a challenge.
I served for 20 years in the Iowa State Legislature, and we have been pounded with unprecedented extreme event after unprecedented extreme event in Iowa. 2008 flood, 2011 flood, 2019 flood, derecho in 2020. And it's an extraordinary amount of damage from these unprecedented events. And, I sometimes ask my friends, like when there's flooding that does damage, well, were the engineers who built that just that incompetent, or has something changed? And the answer is something has changed. And so we're facing all these new unprecedented events. And the problem is with climate change is the science is clear. This gets significantly worse until we take much more significant action. And the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the things that have been happening are significant steps, but we need to build on them. We need to do more. The call right now really is for everybody to get more involved in climate change. How are we going to solve this together, right? And there's a role for everybody. We need everybody to be involved in this. This is the defining issue of this century, right? My parents and grandparents, they fought world wars in Europe, right? That was the defining, and the Cold War. That was the defining issue of the 20th century. In the 21st century, the defining issue is climate change, not only because of what we need to do to prevent it from getting worse, but it's to deal with the consequences that we can't avoid, and that requires us to come together to deal with it.
I don't have enough education and knowledge about this stuff. I just go by what I see and the way things used to be. So if they're not the way they used to be, there's got to be something that made it change. You don't have so much debris, Well, that's good. That's good to see. Bugs, That's next season's, if they live. That's the thing. Yeah, that's good to see. all these bugs.
So, got 3. Got 3 good ones. The Citizens Climate Lobby is one of the largest national lobby organizations in the country. They have literally turned lobbying into a science.
The Senate Climate Caucus Republican senators, I put it in the chat. It's Mike Braun, Susan Collins, Lindsey Graham, Lisa Murkowski, Mitt Romney, and Marco Rubio. Thank you.
Susan Collins is a co-sponsor.
She is not a co-sponsor yet. In fact, she's been dubious. She keeps stepping further and further away from carbon pricing, unfortunately. But that's within our means to. That's why we have to send these messages.
And Linda was quoting the Republicans in the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus.
Which 6 Republicans are on that caucus? That's all she's saying. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
What we're working on now is trying to get Congress nationally to adopt carbon fee and dividend, or cashback carbon pricing, a form of carbon pricing proven to be very effective in bringing down carbon emissions, but also equitable in helping low and middle income folks. Particularly, it's been experimented with in Canada, where it has provided, at this point, $736 back to every household in New Brunswick in dividends, paid for by the fossil fuel industry. Has have to pay the carbon price that increases every year. As we speak, the U.S. is the only developed nation without a carbon price.
Every independent analyst, Republican and Democrat alike, agrees that the way that we're going to deal with carbon pollution, notwithstanding some of the climate deniers on the other side of the aisle, is a carbon tax. The rest of the world is moving in this direction. Having a price on carbon is the most efficient, cost-effective, and fair way to deal with this crisis. But they're having none of it. As I say, they're making stuff up.
The UN has called carbon pricing a quote-unquote necessary condition for stabilizing the climate, meaning we'll need more stuff, but this kind of is not going to happen without carbon pricing. So that's always been the cornerstone of what Citizens Climate Lobby has been working on.
We now know Europe is looking at a system that would impose import duties based upon carbon pricing. So we're seeing the European community starting to impose those types of requirements. So for America to be competitive, we need to adjust to the global reality. To have a level playing field, there should be a true cost for the carbon in products so that we can not only compete, but we can reduce our carbon footprint. Carbon pricing is not only being talked about in Congress, there are meaningful discussions taking place across party line to how we can deal with the pricing of carbon. It's not so much any opposition to the philosophical base, it's more how you impose the tax, whether it goes back to the consumers, whether it's used for other purposes. So there's those questions that are being asked, but I think there is growing numbers who understand that you need a level playing field and there needs to be an adjustment for the cost of carbon.
4 or 5 years ago, I was over Northwest Harbor, and it was in November, and there was 2 guys over there. They had trap nets up on the north end where the shooters boxes are. Right. And so they came over by me and we chatted for a while. I looked down. Now they emptied 2 pound nets, right? They had less than they had about a half a tote full of fish. And some were butterfish, but I couldn't really tell what the rest were. Yeah. And this guy says to me, "You know why the scallops are dying off?" I said, "I have no idea." Well, he says it's oyster pea. I said, "What?" He said, "It's oyster pea. All them oysters they're growing them cages up bay, that's from them." I go, "Okay." And I'm thinking, do you know how many trillions of gallons of water that they're traveling through between up there? I mean, not they are, but they're...
Well, look at back in the 50s, so you had oyster grounds everywhere. Out in Gardiner's Bay,
all around it. You had, I think, something like 24 oyster companies in Greenport alone. So the millions and millions and millions, gazillions of oysters that were around here in the 50s. If it was oyster pea, there wouldn't have been no fish at all.
Exactly, because there was a whole lot. And these
lot
were
more.
Yeah, and I remember back in the 70s and stuff, scalloping off of Sag Harbor and stuff, between the starfish and conchs. We hardly had any room, because back then it was against the law to throw conchs back overboard because they were shellfish predators. Same with starfish, of course. And I had so many conchs and starfish in the boat, I almost didn't have any room for scallops.
Hi, my name is Anastasia Nefedova. I'm visiting here from Seattle, Washington, and I'm a graduate student in sustainability. So I'm very passionate about climate and climate change solutions because of the impact on sustainable development. I'm currently working on my first venture, which is called Regenerate. And Regenerate is a company that combines agrivoltaics with regenerative soil use. So agrivoltaics is a fancy word to combine solar generation with land use in order for us to maximize the productivity and efficiency of our lands. And what we do is we plant pollinator flowers to restore natural habitats and provide natural reforestation solutions in communities that need it the most, which are rural communities in America. It's absolutely scalable. In fact, the mission of our company is to convert 1% of all agricultural land to agrivoltaics, because doing so provides a dual income stream to landowners, and they can use that money to move from conventional agriculture to regenerative agriculture, which is really important. As we heard Al Gore say, if we all move to regenerative agriculture, we will restore the natural equilibrium of the earth. We will recreate natural habitats so the species can return, and we will have nutritious, healthy products that we can eat instead of eating things that are full of pesticides.
As for New York City, aside from our lobsters relocating to Maine and our scallops on the verge of disappearing, New York City is a virtual flood zone. So in 30 years or so, you may be eating your fancy dinner down at the Tribeca underwater sushi bar and grill.
You know, there's an awful lot of money to be made by the fossil fuel industry, and they protect that money. And the way they protect it is they get in the way of real information. The fact is, if people, for example, if people in New York knew that the rising oceans were going to affect them, $129 billion worth of New York City real estate is already in flood zones. 80% of New Yorkers and people in New Jersey are coastal. That's 80% of the population. It will strongly affect. New York Harbor, according to the New York DEC, is already 15 inches higher than it was just in 1900. And of course, when we talk about rising sea level hitting New York Harbor, the Hudson River is not actually a river. It's a tidal estuary all the way up till Troy. So they're talking about a possible 71-inch rise in the Hudson River over the course of the century if sea level rise goes on unabated, which disinformation, to the degree people listen to it, will allow to happen, but will allow those corporations to continue making profits at our expense. So we have to stop it. Got to get in the way of disinformation. We've got to tell the truth and uplift the people instead of just corporate profits.
I think people don't understand that they can engage with their elected officials. Like, voting is great. I think people know they have to do that, even though we still have to push a lot of people to do that. But there's a lot you can do in between elections. You can call your member of Congress. You can email them. They work for you, and they need to know what you're concerned about. So I think we really help people understand that they can get involved politically, and we help people understand the climate issue at large, and that there are solutions in place that we can work together to bring to Congress.
When I first entered the legislature in January 2017, there were very few people talking about climate issues. Some of it had come up nationally in the presidential election, but when we started the session in 2017, there wasn't much discussion. I heard about it at all. And in my 8 years, there's been limited discussion. I mean, there's some so-called experts and people that this is sort of kind of their baby. They carry it, and we just kind of defer and let them work on it. And it seems almost like it's something in the background that someone's working on, but it's not in the forefront. It really should be in everything we do. We should be looking at climate and the implications. And I think people finally realized that when we had a few storms here in the winter time that devastated a lot of our communities. So that's when people really started taking it seriously, and that's when our governor, who I've never seen her go to this level, she gave a State of the State address, and she only talked about 2 items, which is very rare. Usually you cover everything, but one of the 2 items was climate.
Like other states, also feeling the brunt of extreme weather events, Maine is not safe from climate change. We know more storms will come, and make no mistake about it. It is climate change that is causing storms to be more frequent, more intense, and more devastating. The scientists know this. The meteorologists know this. Farmers, fishermen, foresters know this. Our sportsmen know this. Our kids know this. We all know this now.
And she called out anyone who denied it, and basically said we need to sort of get our act together, but we need to make changes. I mean, the water is getting so warm here. It's obviously having an impact on different species, and we just really need to work together and have honest conversations. But doing things the way we've always done them, it's just not going to work, and we'd be foolish to continue to move at a slow pace. We really need to have a sense of urgency.
The fluctuating crab population of the Chesapeake Bay requires a constant monitoring of the young blue crabs. With climate change and predators, the population can actually vary from year to year.
So we're going to take you over here, we're going to go around the backside of Goodwin Islands, and then we're going to sample, pull the scrape through the seagrass bed, and hopefully we'll catch some of this year's young juvenile blue crabs. What we're going to do when we sample, to sample properly so that we don't disturb the crabs, we sample in a banana shape, meaning that we put out the scrape, and then the scrape we go around so that the scrape actually goes on the side and we're not disturbing the crabs. That allows us to sample the crabs properly.
We're keeping that, by the way.
We're keeping that? Oh, okay.
For the crab,
For the crab experiment?
Sure.
So the way that you can hold a blue crab so it doesn't pinch you is you hold it by the base of the 5th legs, the swimmer legs. And that way it can't reach around. Any place else it'll just reach right around and pinch you, and they hurt. Yeah, we're conducting a whole series of experiments in what we call mesocosm tanks. So they're simulated seagrass patches, and what we're trying to assess is what the level of cannibalism and predation is on these young juveniles as a function of their density. We're also looking, there's a disease that is actually more prevalent now with warming temperatures, and that disease infects crabs, and the crabs become lethargic and so on, and we think they become more susceptible to predators and cannibalism. So blue crabs love to cannibalize. Larger crabs, at times, half of their diet is other smaller blue crabs. And so in some ways it's a regulating mechanism for the population. But we're trying to assess just what the interaction is between this disease that is becoming more prevalent because of the warming temperatures, and we're actually getting some higher salinities. And so we're trying to assess what that's going to do to juvenile blue crabs and eventually to the population and to the fishery. So those crabs that you're seeing in there, those small crabs, those actually came in last year. They came in last fall, and they're growing and they're going to mature sometime either late this year or early next year.
My name is Anya Kamenetz, and I live in Brooklyn. I am a writer and journalist. I quit my job a couple of years ago to work full-time on the intersection of climate and our well-being, and especially our children's well-being. I really see climate as an intergenerational justice issue. And so out of that, I write a newsletter, I write articles. I work with a group called This is Planet Ed at the Aspen Institute, which is focused on education and climate. And then I also work with a group called Climate Mental Health Network. And one of the things we did was we created this climate emotions wheel. So the climate emotions wheel is based on research by Panu Kukala in Finland. And it's really just showing that there's such a range of feelings that you can have about climate, not just the fear and the sadness and the despair and the anger, which are all really, really important. There's also room for positive emotions like awe and empathy and curiosity and interest. And the reason that I think this is important is multifold. So first of all, our feelings about climate change are causing a lot of people to live in denial. It's too scary, therefore we don't talk about it. It's too depressing, therefore we don't talk about it. And I don't think we should be afraid of our emotions. I think it's pretty basic psychological insight that experiencing our feelings will lead to a healthier life and a happier life. And so all of these feelings can be managed, especially when we connect with each other, when we connect with nature, and when we start to take action on the problem. So I want to raise that awareness. I want our kids to have a space to share their feelings, because we know there's a huge mental health crisis. And I think that talking frankly about climate change and the solutions is part of addressing that.
One of the most interesting things I found while making this film was the diversity of the people that I've met. Young people, old people, people of every religion, every race across the world are all coming together for a single cause. Climate change really erases all the boundaries between people.
Me personally, I think the scallops that we caught last fall were a little different. I mean, they were very deep.
I said the same thing to him, and they opened different.
Yeah, I didn't have that many to open. I only got out the second day.
Yeah.
The third day they were all gone.
Yeah,
the first day I got my limit. I haven't got my limit on scallops in a long I time. couldn't go the first day because I had an appointment in Riverhead. Richie went out. Everybody had their 5 bushel, and he called me up. But you got to go with me tomorrow. You got to go. So I went out. We had a good day. We had fun. But they looked bigger around, and they were more. They were deeper. They were deeper than our old scallops that we had years ago, back before the brown
and
tide.
they opened different. I commented to him. I said these open different.
Yeah. So maybe I think it's some of the stuff that they grew as seed and put them out, and we did harvest them.
That gal, I can't think of her name now.
Yeah, I can't think. Yeah.
On the town board, called me and said they had Cornell had 40,000 seeds, scallop seed they wanted to plant in Cockles Harbor.
Yeah.
So I said, sure, it's a good idea.
That was what they did 2 years ago. Of course. Anything you can do.
So that was the results of that planning.
I definitely think that. I've got to call her and get a hold of her again. Yeah, that worked. I think it worked. Definitely.
Yeah.
Because that's the only place there's any scallops in the harbor.
That's right. That's
the rest of the harbor, you'd get 1 or 2 scallops here or there. But there, they were thick. So I think definitely that was scallops.
Well, we used to be able to really get a lot in Cockles Harbor, but I got so many moorings out there now.
That's
another thing.
How many boats do you think are dumping raw sewage overboard?
I don't know. I don't think as much as they used to be.
Oh, not as much as they used to be.
No,
Well, never mind raw sewage. I don't know if I can pull it up. Probably I can't. But a couple of years ago, when we were scallop off sheep pens and along Oceanic.
Yeah.
Well,
You showed me.
This is out in the area where all the visiting boaters have to anchor.
It's in the anchorage.
Well, you should have seen the
fuel.
No.
The debris.
Garbage debris.
Oh.
They just threw. It's unbelievable.
Both cone boards were full. You know, my cone boards are 7 foot long on each side.
Yeah.
Right? Something full. Full.
Years
of
ago,
garbage.
we used to get a lot of stuff thrown that were just discarded from the boats at anchorage, and I've never seen that much though. That's a lot.
It was terrible.
Yeah.
You wouldn't believe. We had a drone. We had a drone. We had a flashlight. We had bottles like you wouldn't believe.
Had a dog's leash with a collar. Thank God the dog wasn't in it.
Fishing poles,
Yeah.
cell phones, flashlights.
Crazy.
Just
Every day that I scallop, no matter where I scallop, except when I've been working off of Silver Beach, I only had one old bottle yesterday, but usually I will come in with at least a 5-gallon bucket of garbage that people have thrown overboard.
Yeah,
And
I thought people would have learned by now.
Lack of regulations of our oceans over the last 40 years is literally diminishing the ability of the ocean to be the last bastion of carbon capture on this planet. We are doing this to ourselves.
The Yellow Ocean Project is a journalism nonprofit. We're based in Washington, D.C. For me, if I could take 10 steps back to take 3 steps forward, I'd say one of my goals is to get the global public, including U.S. consumers and U.S. readers, etc., to reimagine how they think of the space, how they think of the oceans, whether it's near shore or high seas. And the way to first rethink it is that this is a universe that is very different than on land. One of its differences is that it's woefully under-regulated, under-policed, under-enforced. How it starts to narrow down into a climate issue is, the oceans, whether, again, near shore or high seas, are the lungs of the planet. They filter the air we breathe. They are the temperature stabilizer of the planet. But it's not the water, it's the marine life in the oceans. And if we just had the water tomorrow, but none of the marine life, the oceans wouldn't serve those life-saving purposes. So the industrial way that kind of the last 40 years especially have seen these waters raked of biodiversity, of marine life, is unsustainable from a climate perspective, because the planet is burning up, and one of the few things that can capture the carbon and stabilize the temperature a little bit more are the oceans. But as we take too much marine life out of the oceans, that capacity disappears. So I think that's where you see an intersection between the lack of governance, the lack of accountability, an unsustainable industrial fishing industry, and climate.
So one reason this is particularly important for us here in Maine, is that we are right here, we're on the Atlantic Ocean, right out the bay, and the Atlantic Ocean relies on several different currents. We have the Gulf Stream, that is the warm current that's coming up the coast, and then we have the cooler Labrador current that's coming down from Canada, from Greenland. And as we are getting more and more melt, so for example, we are now getting 30 million tons of ice per hour melting from Greenland. So you can try to calculate what that is. As that cool water is running into the ocean, it's fresh water. It's cool, it doesn't sink. And the ocean circulation system works with cold water in the polar regions, sinking down, bringing nutrients down through the water column, and then going back down towards the equator. And what's happening is this cooler water, because it's mixing with this fresh water, isn't as dense and it's not sinking, so it's staying it's staying closer to the surface. And this is creating localized areas of warming and less salination, and then with the ocean coming in here, absorbing more carbon dioxide, much more acidic environment. So we are finding with the Gulf of Maine that it is warming, and we know that the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming bodies of water in the world. And it's shallow. We've got the Georges Banks. It's C-shaped. Water gets in here and it doesn't really leave, so there's no real flow. So it's able to warm up, and that is directly impacting, our fisheries, our lobster, scallops, oysters that aren't hardening, for example, or species. We're catching fish out here that should be caught in New Jersey and Maryland, and fish that we are monitoring here are now being caught off of the Maritimes in Canada.
The ocean is a big place with plenty of human-caused issues, which is only exacerbated by climate change. But it's the ability of people like Dr. Allison Calder and Dr. Susanna Hancock and Dr. Peter Oyster and others who are working passionately to find solutions to the damage that we have caused. That gives me hope. When enough people in Congress, people with money, people who can affect change on a national and global scale, get behind the science of climate change, maybe we can avoid what science tells us is coming.
I often focus on disinformation, and especially not just the fossil fuel companies themselves and what they knew and what they did with that information, but also this whole ecosystem they've created around themselves of other people who help to tweak information for them. So to me, that's like the toughest thing to get on top of, because you don't just have the oil companies, you also have PR firms, the law firms, the lobbyists, the university researchers, the management consultancies, all doing their heavy lifting for them and really like laundering their messaging in all of these different ways, which fundamentally kind of warps how we understand stuff. So even before you get to climate change, you have these companies instilling in us an idea of what the environment is, how it works, what the economy is, what the relationship between the environment and the economy is, and they're doing that like over and over again. As early as the early 1900s, you have fossil fuel companies being like beta testers of market research. They were really, really early on all of this stuff, polling, all of it. Like they were so far ahead of really shaping the information ecosystem and really trying to shape people's like fundamental understanding of how things work in order to make sure that they would, at least most of them, most of the time, would vote along with what the fossil fuel industry wanted, and that they could secure a certain type of economic system that would allow them to continue to flourish, which mostly meant no regulation of anything related to their product. I think the peer review process is one way most of the science that says that it's like air, it's sunspots or volcanoes or whatever, is not peer reviewed. And for that reason, actually, some of the folks in the kind of climate denial camp have been trying to attack the peer review system for a long time. Why? Because their studies can't get through it, because they're not factually based. I think you're actually seeing it come up in litigation a lot in this really interesting way where there was a case in Montana recently where they had a bunch of scientists who were like, I don't think that humans are causing it, fossil fuels, whatever, right? They were supposed to testify and they all backed out at the end. And a lot of people were like, yeah, like I think, you can't get away with saying something that is untrue in court. And that, that quote unquote evidence won't stand up in a litigation kind of situation. So yeah, there's that. And I think sometimes too, I feel like I often will get emails from, kind of old school climate denier folks, and they'll send me one of these studies and I'll kind of point out like, well, it's not accounting for this, it's not accounting for that. Where's the original data coming from? And send them off on a little like fact-finding mission. And on like 9 times out of 10, they actually end up realizing themselves that it's a faulty argument. But like, I only have so much time. I can't do it with like every single one of them.
The thing is, with the commercial fishermen, they're not getting paid what they should get paid for their product. The middleman, you go to a market and you're going to pay right now $30 a pound for most anything that you're going to buy. The guys on the boat, Tommy Fields, Tommy, how you making out with the fluke? How much you getting? $1.25 a pound, $1.75 a pound. They can't survive on that.
Yeah.
They got to keep catching more and more and more to try and make a living. So it's
and their size limit is what, an inch or more, less than what we can keep.
No, our fluke was up to 19 and a half. Now I think it's 18 and a half. But the commercial fluke is like 14 inches.
Really?
These fluke have never had a chance to spawn.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Well, they want them. The reason they want them is the market wants them, because the restaurants in the cities want them, because they can sell the whole fish, on a plate.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what they're looking for. But these fish don't have a chance.
And the 19, 20-inch fluke are too big.
Yeah.
For them.
So you flay them off.
Right.
Flay them and you sell them in pieces like you do the haddock and the codfish and everything else.
So My name is Michaela Hamrick. I'm in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and I currently lead the Eastern Panhandle chapter here. I am passionate about all climate issues, coming from a state like West Virginia where the exploitation of resources is ingrained in our history, and I think that West Virginia is worth fighting for. I really do, because young people are leaving in droves and there really is nothing to keep us there. And so I really hope to get out of CCO a way to span the aisle and talk to a lot of conservative, or to speak to a lot of conservative backgrounded, to speak with a lot of people who have a conservative background and try to figure out what we need to do to continue the conversation in making renewable resources for us, renewable energy. I think that that's the best step for West Virginia to progress and to not be stuck in our coal mining past. A lot of West Virginia issues have affected my life personally. My grandfather was a coal miner and my grandparents grew up in a coal mining town. My parents are opioid addicts and are in recovery, and I was a child of teenage pregnancy, and all these issues are so interconnected with climate, with environment, with raising healthy children that want to stay here. So I think my role here is to bring the community together instead of always focusing on the divide between us, that there is some commonality and that at the end of the day, climate issues are people issues, and together we have to make it better for our next generation.
Almost as iconic as blue crabs in the Chesapeake Bay is our native oyster, the eastern oyster, Chrysostrea virginica. The eastern oyster is a keystone species in the Chesapeake Bay because it creates its own living reef habitat, which is incredibly important not only for the oysters, but also for more than 300 other species of the bay that make oyster reefs their home. Unfortunately, our oyster reefs in the Chesapeake Bay over time have been lost to a number of different factors. Historically, there was overharvesting. We've also fallen victim to oyster diseases, as well as sediment inputs and burial of reefs over time. Our oyster population is just a small fraction of what it once was in the Chesapeake Bay. Fortunately, over the last several decades, the Chesapeake Bay has been a target of intensive and deliberate large-scale oyster restoration. In 2014, the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, which was signed by the 6 Chesapeake Bay watershed states, as well as federal agency partners, dedicated the states and the federal agencies to restoring oyster populations in 10 Chesapeake Bay rivers by 2025. Here we sit in 2024, and we are currently have completed 9 out of 10 of those rivers in terms of implementing large-scale restoration.
I knew oysters were a filtering agent, that it does filter and keep clean bodies of water, so you want a healthy oyster crop. And I knew we always had oysters in the Chesapeake Bay, but when it was brought to my attention that we had gotten as low as 1% of the historic population of oysters remaining in the bay, it was an eye-opener to me. At the same time, we were going through certain diseases of oysters that we didn't know how to deal with, that I realized that we had to make an all-out commitment to preserve our oyster crop in the bay, but to expand it, to find a way that we can increase the numbers, because it was important to preserve oysters in the bay from an environmental point of view, from the iconic view of Maryland and Maryland oysters. So that's when I started to get engaged in what we could do to preserve oysters and grow oysters in our state.
So I have the privilege this week to be working on a research project called the Before-After Control Impact Study. So we're working in the South River with partners at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center to use hydrophones, which you may be able to see behind me on the silver platforms. Basically, those are underwater microphones, and what we're doing is recording control areas, places where there has not been oyster restoration, as well as restoration areas, which have received restoration treatment in the last 3 years, and we will collect that acoustic data and compare, can we hear a difference between areas that have no oyster reef present versus those that do, and we're expecting to hear a difference, and a second half of the study is then taking those recordings and playing that robust oyster reef noise at places when we are constructing new oyster reefs in an attempt to attract oyster larvae to those new reef construction sites.
If we get back on the water temperature with the fish, and global warming. I think global warming is the problem. That's why lobsters are all going north. But also we're getting a lot of southern fish up here in our area. We're getting the triggerfish, cobia. Yeah, we're seeing here, which we never seen before. But what that has as far as temperatures, as far as our fish, I don't know if it's inhibiting them or all, it's.
So, I mean, the challenge for understanding, what are the drivers of change? We know communities of organisms are changing on land, along the coasts, in the deep ocean. And we see those effects. Most people see those effects by what they see in the marketplace. And fishermen see those effects by what they can land and changes in populations and their ability to make a living by exploiting wild populations in a sustainable manner. Well, if you look over the course of decades, we can see changes in the fish community here, which are probably the most evident to people who dunk a hook to catch their dinner, or drag a net or set traps and try to make a living commercially out of the ocean. Things are changing. There's waters warming. Animals that were mostly distributed to the south of us are now moving north. This is also more amenable to introductions of species that come through shipping or releases from the aquarium trade, or where animals can find a place in our coastal oceans. And so there's the actual ecological effects of fishing, which were removing the numbers of animals beyond sustainable levels, the effects of fishing gear on seafloor habitats that are mostly out of sight, out of mind, the effects of invasive species, the effects of coastal modification, dredging, seawalls, things that run off from our land. And then the more of us that there are, the more these effects are more widespread.
What do you do with an invasive species who has no predator and eats everything in sight?
The invasive blue catfish was introduced into the Chesapeake Bay in the 1970s in the James River in Virginia, but since that time its population has exploded and is now found in nearly every tributary from the James all the way up to the Susquehanna. And these are catfish that feed on pretty much anything they can find, including blue crabs, juveniles, and small adults. We don't have an estimate of the impact that blue catfish predation is having on our blue crab population, but we do know that they consume blue crabs. There was one study in a tidal portion of the James River in Virginia which estimated that in a 12 square kilometer segment, so not even the entirety of the river, they were consuming upwards of 2 million crabs per year in that one segment of the James. So this could be having an incredible impact on our blue crab population. For invasive species, a lot of times, if you can't beat them, eat them. So that's what we're trying to do here in the Chesapeake Bay with blue catfish. We're fortunate that they're incredibly abundant, they're tasty fish, they're a fun fish for recreational anglers to fight. And so Chesapeake Bay Foundation, resource managers, and many other organizations have been encouraging anglers and commercial harvesters to target blue catfish to remove as many of them from the population as we can.
That's the question I want to ask you. Any adult scallops, they should be dying right now.
So far,
find any blue runners?
The last big ones I got were down off of a promise, down towards past Five Points Point.
Right.
And they were good. They were. I was surprised because I expected, years ago, this time of year, if you had a color board with a lot of scallops on it, all of a sudden you could smell the ones that were in the process of dying, and God, was that some smell.
I was just trying to figure out, because we are losing our scallops earlier, and it seems to me like all of a sudden now they're lasting longer. So I think when they propagate them scallops, like I told them, they're propagating them too early, so they're dying early. They were dying in before the season even opened, right?
Right.
So now hopefully they're moving that up about 3 months, so that the scallops will live into January and February and March,
right,
like they should be.
Right.
I think if they do that, it might be a big help for the scallop industry. We're hoping it gets better. We got a young lady that's working on it. We do. She's reseeding oysters and clams and scallops, mainly scallops. Last year she put out a spot in Couples Harbor. I don't know how many thousands and thousands and thousands of bugs she put out. But they were in the water for probably 5 or 6 months, and she came to me and said, "Something's wrong. All my scallops are gone." I says, "Are there any empty dead? Did they die? Is there any empty shells?" And she says, "No, they're just gone." I said, "Well, scallops swim, and they always swim to better places." So they were to the south of what we call the flats, off of where the Cedars is. And sure enough, we found them the first couple of days of scalloping, and they were big, beautiful, beautiful scallops.
The nicest I've seen in a long
Yeah,
time.
yeah. And also they had a bunch of scallops over in Sag Harbor. I think it seems to be they were the same scallop.
What I work on now is mostly climate litigation. And in the climate litigation sphere, you have all these cities and states and counties who are suing the oil companies, accusing them of fraud, that they knew better, they knew this was a problem, and they didn't act on it, and they didn't tell us, they didn't warn us, they had their own science. And then they ran campaigns of deception to try to fool people about it and keep politicians and keep government from acting. And we've wasted 30, 40 years because of these actions. So it really is consequential. Now we have far worse climate change than we would have if we had started doing something about it in the 80s. And, for example, the Annapolis suit here, they're suing BP and Chevron and Shell and Exxon and others. And the accusation is, you knew better. This problem is terrible. Now it's costing us a lot of money because Annapolis is going underwater from sea level rise. And big tides, big storms cause a lot of damage there. And you've got to pay. So they're going to collect damages from these corporations. Part of the story is these companies use surrogates. They hired and they funded and they didn't have to convince them very hard. They got all these other actors, all these other bad guys to come into the room and deny the science and attack renewable energy and attack the policies and measures that would help climate change. And they did it on instinct. They really didn't need to be scripted. And these are groups like the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, American Legislative Exchange Council, Frontiers of Freedom. There's a bunch of them. And they're right-wing or libertarian think tanks, organizations, nonprofits that have been around since the 70s and longer. And they're built to fight government. They're built to fight against government policies. Anything that happens, they fight against it. So if they had won their campaigns, your teacher would be smoking in front of the classroom. You'd have no airbags in your car. There'd be no Consumer Product Safety Commission. There'd be no, regulation of anything. There'd be no Department of Education or Department of Transportation, Department of Energy if they had their way, or Environmental Protection Agency. This is literally what they have fought for, is to erase those government structures that protect us. So thankfully they've lost most of those campaigns. But on climate change, they have had an impact for sure. They have targeted Congress. They've targeted with specific communications certain populations of people, and they've created uncertainty. So when you hear Senator Inhofe, as you mentioned, is a great example of that. When you hear his words, or President Trump's words when he came in, it's a hoax, there's nothing happening here. Those are the same words that have been echoed for years and years by these think tanks and these actors who were paid by Exxon, the Koch brothers, and other corporate entities who really gave them oxygen in the 90s and the 2000s. They would do it anyway, honestly, but they're being, they're being puppeted, or they're being given, incentive by these corporate dollars. So that's in these lawsuits, the naming of these other actors. I look at the politicians as kind of the larger scale puppets. Like they find a politician who will say what they want to say, and they're like, go, go, go.
Can you give me some names?
Senator Manchin from West Virginia has been terrible. He probably he wouldn't call himself a climate denier, but he has tried to promote coal and stop, good things from happening. You have, there's not many hardcore deniers. There's more in the House. There's a couple, Looney Tunes congressmen from Louisiana and other oil states. Often it'll be from an oil state. You'll see somebody who's really fringe on this stuff, and they're from Oklahoma or Louisiana or Wyoming, where all the coal comes from, or West Virginia. But they're, slowly they come around, or they start to modulate their voice and say, well, I think it might be a problem, but we need to study it. I think it might be a problem, but we don't want to hurt the economy. There's all stages of denial. So I think another thing to characterize is climate denial is not just denying that there's anything happening. It's also delaying and slowing down the reaction by denying the policies, or saying it's not so bad, or saying we need to study it. I mean, you can look at any environmental problem. The first reaction of polluters is to deny the science. The second one is, well, we need a study. That's going to take 10 years. We'll study it for a while. We'll assess the problem. That buys them time. Then when they realize they can't fight that anymore, then they figure out how to fight it on economics. Well, we don't want policies that hurt anybody, right? So then you have embedded rights to do pollution, and you just are allowed to continue. It literally goes that. It's comical to some degree, but that's the stepwise process. And then we get into, how does Congress pass laws, and how does anything get done in this country?
What I'm against is giving people information that they don't want. There's a certain number of people in the United States and across the world that no matter what you tell them, they are not going to be able to hear it from you. But there are also people that haven't yet made up their mind, and I think that that's actually the place where information is actually really powerful. I think where misinformation has already deeply taken hold, it becomes not only difficult but almost counterproductive to focus your energy there. And I say that simply because of the Yale Climate Communications study about the global warming 6 Americas, which basically puts the doubtful and dismissive people, particularly the dismissive people, into a small percentage of people in the United States. If we want to see action on climate change, those people don't necessarily need to be converted. The people that need to be converted are the people that I think really need to be targeted are the people that are already kind of cautious. It's that cautious group, but not outright denialists. If they're cautious and they have information, then they could all of a sudden become concerned. And from concerned, they could become alarmed. And it's those people who are alarmed about climate change who actually want to push for government action, who actually want to push for some kind of solution. To try to take somebody who is completely in denial and convert them into somebody who is very alarmed, I don't know if it's a great use of energy, also because they don't want the information that we're trying to give them. And I really don't want to try to push things on people that they don't want. But what I will say from my own experience covering climate change is that people who are cautious about climate change or about what's happening, the best way to get to them is to talk to them face to face. It's not to send them a meme. It's not to send them a diatribe over Facebook about some post that they made. It's to have a coffee with them, understand where they're coming from, and have you understand, and have them understand where you're coming from. One thing that I've really learned in 10 years of covering disinformation is that a regular person who is misinformed about something is not the problem. The problem is the purveyor of the misinformation. If you want to get mad at somebody, get mad at the profit-seeking entity using their power and profits to confuse people for their own benefit. Do not get mad at the people who were fooled by a very expensive, very sophisticated, probably very convincing effort to mislead them. Of course they were misled. It is not their fault.
I definitely have some colleagues and folks I know in that political world who, if you were having a beer with them privately, would acknowledge the reality of the climate crisis. But they're not about to do anything about it, because to seriously confront it, you have to fight the fossil fuel industry tooth and nail, and they're just never going to do that. Sadly, I mean, I'm just going to tell you the truth. I think the American people increasingly get this, want to see us stand up to big oil. But in terms of the Republican Party, no. The climate champs that we have are leaving the Republican Party. They are retiring. They're being driven out. And we're getting more extreme climate deniers and, frankly, people that are extreme about a lot of other things as well.
Conference is going great. So we have over 1,000 volunteers here. We have people from all 50 states and Washington, D.C. So we've got truly folks from all over the country here. And it's great. One of our goals was to have enough of a crowd here that we were pre-pandemic levels of engagement, because of course that was really difficult for a group like ours where we get together in real life, we meet face to face. And so one of the goals of the conference was to get back to those levels, and so we already are successful at what a huge group we have here. And yeah, I think people are having a wonderful time. The keynotes are fantastic. The sessions are really informative. Everybody seems really energized and excited to go to the Hill on Tuesday. And so we've got 432 meetings, I believe, confirmed at last count. And so that's an incredible number. That's nearly all of Congress. And nobody really does that. So it's a unique thing that we're doing, and everybody's really excited to be part of it.
We had the best years here in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and it's really changed up until now. And it's not changing for the better, which we've said before, but we had good times. We could live off the land. We could go hunting anywhere we wanted, people's property. The summer people would leave, and we'd go on their property and harvest rabbits, pheasants, quail, whatever. Duck shooting, we did a lot of duck shooting. But that's all gone now because everybody's got fences around their property and trees. There's a place I go clamming down on West Neck Road. I had a good spot there for soft clams. And I'd go down the edge of the people's property and never bother nothing. And they must have had a camera on me or something. And a little while later, there's a fence and all kinds of bushes. And the trouble is, to the left of it is a steep bank, and you can't get down. It's all overgrown. So you can't get to the water.
Yeah. We first moved here a little over 50 years ago. I used to tell Lynn, I said, geez, 50 years ago, it must have been really neat around here. That's 100 years ago.
Yeah. And now you're saying 50 years, you're saying the same thing what you said when you came.
Back then, you couldn't catch them all. It was open from September 15th until the end of March.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you could get out in those 3 bad months, there were still scallops until they died. Because they die in February, March, they die.
They only have a 2-year life cycle.
18 months.
And now?
Now, we had 2 good days in Cockles Harbor. Wayne's been busted his chops and his wife going out.
Yeah, like we said earlier, back in the 50s, 60s, even the 70s, we could go out and get our limit, which at that time was 10 bushel, in a matter of a few hours, right?
Yeah.
2 people on the boat, usually wife and husband, or wife and boyfriend, whichever. But today, I've been out 2 days in a row, and I come in with about a bushel and a half, which.
How many scallops is that?
How many scallops?
Yeah, a bushel and a half.
Only amounted to 8.5 pounds.
Wow. Okay.
And that's unbelievable to say. Oh yeah, I did good today. I got a bushel and a half.
Is the outlook for our planet truly gloom and doom, or is there some hope?
We know that there has been a concerted effort to demotivate folks to acting on this or distracting them. I have a copy in the other room of a Time magazine. The person of the year for Time magazine in 1989 was The Planet. We know for almost my entire life, we've known that climate change was a threat. And first it was denial, and then delay and distract. And now it's doomism. It's trying to say, it's too late to do anything. We should just throw our hands up and give up. But that's just not true. There's a lot we can still do. And while we are in further, worse trouble than we would have been had we acted 20, 30 years ago, we know there's a lot we can do. And fortunately, the technology for us to transition away from fossil fuel energy on a global level is already happening. We just have to accelerate that and make sure we're taking care of folks on the bottom and middle income levels as well. And it can't just be the affluent who can afford it. We've got to make sure we're doing it the right way. And that's why carbon fee and dividend makes so much sense. There's a lot of reasons to have hope. There's kind of two things are accelerating at the same time. The feedback loops and the scary stuff that's happening on climate-wise, which Susanna can tell you about. The scary stuff is accelerating at a faster clip, which is very, very frightening. But at the same time, the transition is happening much faster. When I first opened up that MIT's Sloan School and Climate Interactive Model En-ROADS, it would show you that if with business as usual, would get us to 4.1 degrees centigrade. Now, that's an aggregate of a lot of different models, but that's really, really bad. That's kind of game over. Now, just 4 years later, you open it up and it's down to 3.3 average temperature increases over the planet, which is, 0.8 of a degree is a huge move in the right direction. And a lot of that's just coming because renewable energy is getting so much cheaper, so much faster than people thought. It still could be game over, but it's a trend line going in the right direction. So there's, good things are happening. We just have to accelerate it.
One part of my job is working with decision makers around the world, and those decision makers can be heads of states, presidents of countries, global CEOs, but one really important one is also the heads of the fossil fuel companies. And these are people in many ways I'd rather pretend don't exist, but I have had the opportunity to meet with some of these people, and I think one moment that was particularly poignant for me was at the World Economic Forum in 2023 now. And I met with the sustainability director for one of the globe's biggest plastics company. And he and I had the chat. We were going over some of Al Gore's climate trace data. We were looking at tracking methane emissions, what he says he's doing, what he now has to say he's emitting, and where they're going with their company. And this guy is in charge of greenwashing for his company. He is trying to make plastics look good and look environmentally sustainable and look like the green future for sort of his company. So, having heard all of that in our discussion, he was telling me a little bit, small chat, making light of his family, and telling me a little about his family, and he said that, he had 2 young children. So I said, great, you've got 2 young children. How do you sleep at night knowing you've got 2 young kids and that you are the director for this big international global company on making plastics look great? And he said 2 things. He stays at work until his kids have gone to bed, so he doesn't need to see them in the evenings. And he hopes his entire family dies in a crash together before his kids are old enough to know what he does. And I was floored. I was like, these people are legitimately evil. And it really changed my mind from feeling, how do we work with companies to make sure they know what they're doing, what their environmental impact is, to saying these aren't necessarily people who care, or they are here for profit, and it's profit above people. And the fact that he felt his entire interest in his company, in his business, was better than his own children, I didn't know what to do with that information.
We have to avoid the dangers of what you might call, some people have called techno-optimism. We have seen so many miraculous technological advances that we have become vulnerable to the false belief that new technologies are going to save us in every sphere. Sometimes they just don't. And some people hold out the idea, don't worry, we'll have this magical breakthrough and the technologists will solve it for us. Not always, often not the case for sure. The fact that we have what we need is the important factor.
We don't have time for fake climate solutions. This is a distraction. This will set us back. It'll keep us from doing the stuff that will solve the climate crisis. So it's really important that we call out these fake solutions and push back against them. All of the needs that we would meet with a hypothetical fusion economy can be met with other stuff that we have right now, with renewables, with battery storage, with smarter, more modern grids. So we don't have time to wait around for the maybe of fusion or the false hope of safe, clean, conventional nuclear power. We got to get moving here, and the tools that we have in front of us will work if we just prioritize them and use them. Look, if you're passionate about this, if you're ready to get in and break some eggs and fight against the wealthiest industry in the history of the world, run for office and do what you can to make a difference. Make the changes in your own community. Try to get your own community off of its fossil fuel addiction, your own state. Run for Congress if you got a path to doing that. I need help here. I need more allies. So please, by all means, do it. And just do it in every way that you can. You don't have to be a politician to do it. You can do it as an investor. You can do it as an innovator, an entrepreneur. You can do it as a writer. All of us, I think, have to find the ways that we can lean in and make a difference on this, because we're in it together.
Seals, we've seen a whole lot more seals around here, harbor seals around here, than there used to be in my recollection. And I don't know if they eat scallops, but I know one day off on the southwest corner of Shell Mountain, I was scalloping, and I was catching decent scallops, and I'm saying, oh, the seal pops its head. He looks at me and then goes right back down again. I'm going like, maybe they eat scallops, I don't know. I know that fish. So I can't really, I don't really have a 100% guaranteed thing that this is the reason. I think it's a combination of things, and if it was only one problem, it wouldn't be so bad, but I think it's a combination of a number of different problems, and the total of it is caused the demise and the scalloping.
So clearly, all of us, the residents of this planet, are being affected by climate change in many different ways. Whether you're a scalloper out on the Oceanic, a waterman on the Chesapeake, a farmer in Tornado Alley, California resident who lost their house to a wildfire, or the residents of Miami who are being flooded out of their houses monthly. All of us are being equally affected by climate change. But my hope is we've gone past the point where we can say somebody's going to come along and magically fix climate change. There is no magic bullet. You know what the magic bullet is? Science, passion, and action. Also, it only takes one person. That's it. Is that so difficult?